Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules today to come and join us for our retail leasing webinars, helmed by ANZ Director Kyle Swain, the expert on all things retail leasing, who's been our guiding light for the past couple of months. And Kyle, you have quite an interesting topic for us today in terms of relief schemes for retail tenants.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. Hopefully people will find it interesting, but I still think the best value comes in the second half every week when we open it up to the registrants to ask their specific questions, and we can help people with their specific situations. But to cover off today, I wanted to almost go back to the start and revisit the code as such. Obviously, at this point in negotiating the best possible rent relief and leasing terms under COVID, crucial to that is understanding the code and being able to interpret that and to influence lessors in discussions around the code. So we're going to touch on that a little bit and use two very specific examples from, not surprisingly, the Victorian current situation and their Small Business Commissioner's office down there.
Yes, and with news coming out of Sydney, hopefully we won't be facing a similar situation there, but as more lockdown measures come, we'll be more likely to hear from New South Wales businesses as well.
Well, it can happen anywhere, Jess. 3 reported cases in Queensland today have us a little concerned as well. So,
absolutely.
Still unprecedented times, to use the word that nobody likes using now, and still a major concern ongoing, and not just for this the COVID pandemic period that's defined by the current response period to the end of September. I think we're going to be experiencing this for a lot longer than that, and we need to continue to evolve and to find the best ways to engage with lessors to provide suitable and proportionate relief to tenants, and for the intent of the code to ensure continuity of our retail businesses beyond this period.
Absolutely. So everyone, just a reminder, you can use the Q&A button or the chat button to ask your questions, which will be addressed at the end of this webinar, and Kyle will be able to answer them if they're short and sweet. If you have longer questions, by all means, please ask, but they will be sent off to him privately after this webinar. So if anything pops up, put it in the chat box and it will be read out to the audience. You can be anonymous if you prefer.
Okay, thanks, Jess. And that first screen is up. As I was saying, I wanted to focus on the Commercial Tenancies Relief Scheme, the CTRS, which is the name given to it, particularly in Victoria, essentially covers the relevant pieces of legislation which give effect to the code. Now, I'm not going to go back and preach to you the purpose and the overarching principles, but I've listed those things there because, as I said, your ability to negotiate and influence a lessor and negotiate the best possible rental relief for your business that you can depends on your understanding of the code and your ability to interpret particularly the overarching principles and the leasing principles that are held within it. So once again, if you don't have a copy of the code, you most certainly should have. You can get that from a number of sources. Very quick Google search will bring it up, but you can also go to our website at lpc.com.au, and we have a resource page with all the relevant regulations, but also the code itself. Please familiarise yourself with it, because all the legislation in every state that is put out simply gives effect to the code, but the national mandatory code is what that is all based on, and the intent and the purpose of that and the principles applied by the code is what most discussions will be around. So we might pop on to the next slide, which this week I've reverted to basically covering off 2 frequently asked questions. And instead of using questions that come to us from our clients or from NRA members inquiring, what I've done is gone specifically to the Victorian Small Business Commissioner's own small business website and gone to their fact sheets and resources page and their frequently asked questions. Now, the reason I did this was because it's essentially the Code Administration Tribunal, the group that essentially governs the code and works very closely with all the small business commissioners' offices in each state, and it's their job to administer the binding mediation process. So obviously they need to interpret the code, and in every state there's been very interesting documentation put out by these officers where they've interpreted principles or concepts within the code that really does guide tenant representatives like us, leasing advisors, on how to implement those principles and how to raise it with lessors to overcome roadblocks that we've talked about a number of times over the past few months. So from that website, one of the questions was, does a tenant's eligibility for rent relief change depending on eligibility for and participation in JobKeeper at various points in time? The answer to that specific question is no, and this is their interpretation. The people who would be conducting the mediation, if you had a dispute with a lessor around this, their interpretation is the ATO states that if a business qualifies for JobKeeper payments for the first fortnight because turnover is declined by the required amount, that business remains eligible and does not need to keep testing turnover in the following months. Now, you can essentially interpret that to mean that if, and we've had the case study I'm referring to at the bottom, ATO assessment period was from March, and they applied for the JobKeeper based on that assessment period. They were proven to be eligible, but then in April they only had a 20% impact. That particular business benefited from some things and they had greater impact in February and March, but in April, which is the period of payment or period of rent reduction during the pandemic response period, was only impacted by 20%. So the question was, should they receive 20% rent reduction or no rent reduction at all because it wasn't greater than 30%, which was the lessor's opinion. But this judgment by and response by the Victorian Small Business Commission office states that, or you could imply from it, that it doesn't matter how much the decline is during the period, but once they have been assessed and have been qualified for the JobKeeper, then it doesn't matter beyond that they remain eligible for proportional rent relief, and it's not limited to businesses that have more than 30% impact in any given month. So hopefully I've made that clear. Once you qualify for JobKeeper, that's the 30% impact period. We would be arguing on behalf of our clients and using this as an example that if your impact in any given month drops below 30%, it doesn't mean that you should get no benefit that month whatsoever. This implies that the assessment period is where you need to have had more than 30%, and beyond that you should receive proportional rent relief. So hopefully that makes sense, and this is just one example of that. If we go to the second example I want to bring up, and this is another significant roadblock area in negotiations with landlords, can a tenant who is not under an eligible lease apply for rent relief and assistance? We have addressed this sort of situation a number of times, and yet it's still a major roadblock. At LPC Cressa, we absolutely believe and push very strongly on the basis that the code is designed for all commercial tenants, whether they turn out to be an eligible tenant under the JobKeeper or not. It's all the principles do still apply to all commercial leases. So the response from the Victorian Small Business Commissioner's team there to this question was that yes, where a tenant is not under an eligible lease, the Australian government's mandatory code, which is endorsed by the Victorian government and by all states, by the way, should be used as a guide by the tenant and the landlord. The requirement to negotiate in good faith means landlords and tenants should genuinely cooperate to reach agreement. That doesn't only apply if you are eligible for the JobKeeper scheme. It applies to all commercial leases. And the case study that I'm referring to there was a client of ours who's a national retail brand with more than $50 million in turnover, and therefore many landlords wanted to exclude them from discussions for rent relief as they didn't technically qualify for the JobKeeper scheme. Qualify as an eligible business under the $50 million criteria. So there are lots of these FAQs on the Victorian site, but whichever state you're in, please jump on. In WA, there's amazing things on there I've raised here previously, and every state's small business commissioner puts out these resources, and understanding their interpretation of the code and the principles could provide significant benefit to you in discussions with the landlord. We're always, of course, available to act on behalf of clients and to interpret this and present it in a way that might improve your situation. So please do your homework, understand the code, revert back to those original principles, and take some advice from the interpretations by these government bodies. And that brings us to opening up, hopefully, for some discussion around questions that you have that we can look at real-life examples right at the moment.
Apologies, that was my slip of the finger there. And yes, we actually do have a couple of questions. So let's start with Mark. Has there been any clarification from the federal cabinet or various states that the small medium enterprises mandatory code will be extended in line with the JobKeeper 2.0 extension? As the code is linked to JobKeeper, I assume commercial rent relief will continue for those who continue to qualify for JobKeeper post-September?
Yeah, I think there'll be a few questions along these lines. So I'll just say that at the moment, there's no official word on that, and I don't have any guidance on exactly what will occur. I know, for example, the Code Administration Tribunal are meeting on this exact thing, how to restore confidence to small, medium enterprise and retailers. I think Victoria are kind of driving that at the moment because of their situation, and they'll provide recommendations to the government that I think will filter through other states as well. I know the NRA is already involved in those types of conversations with the administration committee, the Code Administration Committee led by Alan Ween. But at this stage, there's no official guidance on what will happen in terms of the end dates of the regulations and acts that are in place, and how we treat ongoing challenges faced by retailers in as a result of COVID-19. So stay tuned. It might be the topic of our next webinar. I certainly think there'll be some developments over the next 4 weeks.
Okay, and thanks for that. Another question from Mark. So this relates back to the second example you gave before, Kyle. I've heard that some landlords actively try to block/exclude tenant reps from involvement in rent relief discussions on behalf of their clients. Has LTC Cresta experienced any of this?
We haven't, because it's unconscionable to do so. I'm not sure, Mark, why they would try to do that. I actually have heard of a non-disclosure agreement, I think, that tried to prevent anyone else acting on behalf of the client through non-disclosure. So crazy stuff. There can be no reason for it other than them wanting to get away with something that they shouldn't. So if anyone's in that situation, I would immediately do exactly the opposite and involve someone else in that discussion, and certainly feel free to start the mediation process if that's how they want to deal with that. Take advice from your relevant state small business office and the government office, from your small business commissioner. No reason at all for them to be doing that other than to limit the tenant's ability to negotiate a fair outcome.
Yes, we've certainly seen this pandemic and the ensuing crises have brought out some, let's just say, interesting behaviours in people, and not all of them in the good sense. Hopefully that answers your question, Mark. And as always, everybody, if you wanted to ask Kyle some more in-depth questions, you can forward them to marketing@nra.net.au, where I will forward them on to Kyle. All right, so Charles has a couple of questions here. When do you think the decision will be made by the National Cabinet to extend the code to March 2021 in line with JobKeeper?
Yeah, that's the one I just that Mark also had that I've covered off. I think there will be some news around that, but there's no indication as yet as to how they will do that. There's a number of ways they can address it, but we'll see what happens over the next 3 or 4 weeks. I think all their focus right at this moment is on containment, thankfully. And as I said, the Code Administration Committee, led by Alan Ween, and which consults very strongly with the peak bodies such as the NRA and the Shopping Centre Council and so on, are working feverishly in the background to address the current concerns, and also these sorts of interpretations that we've addressed today. So hopefully by the next webinar, some of that will be a lot clearer, and we may cover off that pivot in the next one if there's some guidance around that.
Yes, fingers crossed. And everybody, our next webinar will be held at the end of August, the last Wednesday of August. So an email will be going out to you if you wish to attend. One final question from Charles.
Yep.
An interesting one. Some landlords are seeking to apply a full and final settlement in their agreements. If things get worse or the code is extended, what is your view on a tenant agreeing to a full and final settlement and then going back to try and ask for more rent relief?
Yeah, look, we actually covered this, Charles, 2 weeks ago. I think it was the last one. We covered some legal clauses that are in state legislation that it's legislated to allow tenants in these sorts of situations to reopen negotiations, and to where the financial position is deteriorated or changed significantly, to negotiate additional rent relief. Now, that can't be contracted out. So even if a landlord tries to implement an agreement that they see as full and final, there's legislation in place to protect the tenant in those situations if something was to happen. So we have seen clauses like can't negotiate additional rent if there's a second wave and things like that. But I wouldn't be agreeing to that. All of our agreements have the caveat on it that should the situation change significantly, such as a further lockdown or other conditions being placed on trade, then we reserve the right to seek additional rent assistance. So I wouldn't be signing any agreement like that, and if that's the landlord's insistence, I would be taking that to a mediation process because it's clearly unfair and not in the tenant's best interest. And we've seen with Victoria, possibly in the next week with New South Wales restrictions and who knows which other states may have a second wave and be subject to trading restrictions that will require many people to revisit those agreements. So I wouldn't be signing any. If the landlord's insistent upon it, it becomes a dispute that needs to be addressed with mediation. It's worth going through that process to protect yourself against a very uncertain future.
Yes, and I'm sure that after attending these webinars, all of the attendees are going over tenancy agreements with a fine-tooth comb. So just remember, everybody, help is available thanks to legislation, as Kyle has just said. Okay. Kyle, do you have any final remarks for today?
Well, I guess empathy for everyone going through this, particularly those in Victoria where we've not just seen trading conditions worsen, but second time round's been a real psychological hit to many small business operators in that state. I was on the phone to a leasing executive in Melbourne yesterday who hadn't even been to her shopping centre that she leases since March. So that did make me think of all the landlords who are trying to force tenants to reopen in order to begin negotiations with them as a condition. And yet their own leasing execs don't even visit the shopping centre that they're leasing for safety reasons. So look, it's a very difficult environment, very uncertain future. All the things that we did in the first weeks of this, talking about the economic outlook and leasing conditions after this period and so on, I think a lot of that is in the media right now with the recession, with the biggest fall to CPI ever recorded, various other things. It's a very crucial time. We'll try to cover off as much information that can help you in both COVID rent relief situations as well as your lease going forward and lease renewals, market rent reviews and things like that will be impacted by COVID and the period after this pandemic. So we'll go out to just a monthly webinar, but we'll try to make sure that the content is extremely helpful and very specific to the membership base of the NRA, what they're experiencing.
Absolutely. And if anyone has questions for us, you can certainly reach out to info@nra.net.au with your queries, and we'll do our best to help you as quickly and as best as we can. Thank you everyone for attending today, and for everyone in Melbourne and the Greater Sydney area, people who just want to get home, our thoughts are certainly with you, and stay strong, everybody. We will see you at the end of August. Thank you, Kyle, for your time.
Thanks, Jess. Thanks everyone for coming. Cheers.
Bye.